The humiliation in first class began the moment he walked into the cabin. He had boarded the flight just like every other passenger, but instead of being greeted with courtesy and respect, the eyes of the crew shifted toward him with a mixture of suspicion and discomfort. The black CEO, dressed in an immaculate tailored suit, carried himself with confidence, but in that confined space, it seemed as though his success and presence became an offense. The murmurs were subtle at first, whispers exchanged between flight attendants, glances cast toward him as though questioning his very right to sit in that exclusive section. For him, this was not the first time he had felt the sting of prejudice in spaces he had rightfully earned, but the audacity of being treated as if he were an intruder in first class stung deeper than usual. The seat had been booked under his name, the ticket fully paid for, not an upgrade or a courtesy pass, but a rightful purchase. Yet the questioning tone of the attendant as she checked his boarding pass made it seem as though she expected it to be a mistake. Her eyes lingered too long, her lips pressed in a thin, skeptical line, and though she eventually let him pass, the air of doubt she left behind was heavier than her words. Settling into his seat, he noticed how quickly the other passengers adjusted themselves, shifting slightly away, their gazes a mixture of surprise and quiet disapproval. Some clutched their drinks a little tighter, others avoided eye contact altogether, as if his presence somehow disrupted the unspoken image they believed first class should represent. The true humiliation arrived when the lead flight attendant approached him with a tone coated in false politeness. She leaned slightly closer, her voice barely hiding the edge beneath its surface, and asked if he was sure he belonged in that seat. Her words were careful, chosen to avoid open accusation, but the meaning was unmistakable. It wasn't a matter of ticketing confusion or genuine error. It was a challenge to his presence, a suggestion that someone like him could not possibly afford, deserve, or belong in that space. Other passengers watched, some openly curious, others pretending to be absorbed in their devices but clearly listening. Every second of that moment was meant to belittle him, to reduce his identity as a CEO, a leader, a man of wealth and influence, into something less than human, just another stereotype they felt comfortable enforcing. The humiliation deepened when the flight attendant asked for his ticket again, this time holding it longer than necessary, scrutinizing it as though she expected to uncover a forgery. Her questions dripped with skepticism, each pause deliberate, each glance a reminder that she doubted him. The murmurs from the passengers nearby seemed to grow louder, feeding the tension. He remained calm, his posture unwavering, but inside he felt the familiar burn of anger, a fire fueled not by the inconvenience of being questioned, but by the blatant disrespect wrapped in thin layers of courtesy. It wasn't just about him. It was about the centuries of assumptions, the silent weight of history carried into this single encounter, magnified under the fluorescent lights of a luxury cabin at 30,000 feet in the air. The humiliation wasn't a single act, but a series of small, cutting blows. The attendant offered him water in a tone different from the others, distant and dismissive. When meal preferences were taken, his request was met with hesitation, as though he were being difficult simply for asking. When blankets were distributed, she almost skipped him, forcing him to remind her, only to receive one tossed toward him without the courtesy of careful placement. Each act, on its own, could be brushed aside as poor service, but together they painted a picture too clear to ignore. This was no accident. It was the deliberate stripping of dignity, an effort to remind him that, in their eyes, he did not belong, no matter the title attached to his name or the wealth in his account. Sitting in first class was supposed to be a reward for years of work, sacrifice, and ambition. For him, it represented the countless hours spent building businesses, the endless negotiations, the sleepless nights ensuring his empire stood tall. Yet here, in this narrow aisle lined with plush seats, all of that was dismissed in an instant. He was forced to endure the eyes of those who believed themselves superior, the crew who decided his worth based not on his achievements, but on his skin. Every detail of the cabin that should have felt luxurious, the soft leather, the chilled drinks, the quiet hum of exclusivity, became tainted by the undercurrent of humiliation. The worst of it came when a white passenger arrived late, glancing at the seat next to him with casual entitlement. The same flight attendant who had questioned him rushed to greet the newcomer, her smile bright, her tone warm. The contrast was undeniable. She addressed the white passenger with ease, offering assistance, ensuring comfort, while he sat in silence, treated like an inconvenience rather than a customer. It was a performance for the others in the cabin, an unspoken reinforcement of who was welcomed and who was merely tolerated. The humiliation was public, subtle enough to be excused but sharp enough to cut, leaving him both exposed and underestimated in a space he had every right to claim. The power underestimated in that moment was not just the authority of a wealthy businessman, but the unseen weight of years of persistence, strategy, and triumphs that had shaped him into the leader he was. As he sat silently in that first-class cabin, enduring the pointed stares and the clipped tone of the attendants, no one around him recognized the influence he carried beyond those polished seats. To them, he was simply a man out of place, someone who had wandered into a space they believed belonged only to a select few. They saw his suit, but they did not understand the boardrooms he commanded. They saw his presence, but they ignored the power networks that stretched across industries at his fingertips. They underestimated him because of the skin he was born into, never realizing that the very systems they thought they were defending were ones he had learned to bend, navigate, and eventually dominate. The crew's perception of him was shaped by narrow assumptions. They assumed wealth had a certain look, that authority spoke with a certain accent, that prestige carried a certain face. Their treatment of him was not just about disbelief, but about the refusal to accept that someone like him could embody success at its highest levels. Every time they questioned his ticket or hesitated to serve him, it was not about the transaction. It was about erasing the possibility of his power. They believed their actions would go unchallenged because, in their world, passengers like him were rare, and when they appeared, they were easily dismissed. What they did not realize was that the man sitting quietly in front of them had the ability to make decisions that could ripple across companies, affect reputations, and alter futures. His silence was not weakness, it was calculation. The white passenger who received warm greetings and effortless service represented the shallow surface of privilege. The staff's immediate shift in tone when serving him reflected their ingrained bias, their inability to see beyond the stereotypes they carried. They underestimated the black CEO by comparing him to an imagined standard, assuming that true wealth and power would never wear his face. They believed that by treating him with subtle disrespect, they could diminish his confidence, but instead, they revealed their ignorance. For him, it was almost surreal to watch them make the mistake of underestimating the very person who could change the course of their airline's narrative. They had no idea who he was, and in that ignorance, they gave him all the leverage he would need. Power underestimated often grows silently in the shadows of arrogance. The attendants believed they had the upper hand because they held authority in that cabin, dictating service and comfort, deciding who belonged and who did not. Their sense of control blinded them to the fact that real power does not shout or demand validation. Real power sits quietly, taking note of details, watching mistakes unfold, and waiting for the moment to act. As he sat there, observing every slight and every insult, he was not broken down but building a strategy. He knew that the arrogance of the crew was born from their assumption that their actions would carry no consequences. They thought he was a faceless passenger, someone who would leave the plane and vanish into obscurity, never to be heard from again. They thought wrong. What they could not see was the empire he had built. They did not know about the companies under his leadership, the thousands of employees whose livelihoods depended on his vision, or the board members who hung on his every decision. They had no knowledge of the partnerships he held with other industry leaders, of the media platforms where his voice was respected, of the financial institutions where his signature could shift millions. To them, he was a seat number, a figure they tried to push into submission. By underestimating him, they revealed their lack of awareness of how fragile their own positions truly were. The passengers around him also played a role in this underestimation. Their silence spoke volumes. Their unwillingness to challenge the disrespect reinforced the belief that he was powerless. They assumed that because he chose not to argue, he was defeated, when in reality, restraint was his sharpest weapon. He had learned long ago that true power does not need to be announced in the heat of humiliation. It waits, patiently, until the stage is set for a response that no one can ignore. Their misjudgment of his calm demeanor was their downfall. They saw composure as submission, and in doing so, they underestimated the storm quietly brewing behind his stillness. In the sterile luxury of that first-class cabin, they believed they were guardians of exclusivity, gatekeepers of who deserved to be there. What they failed to grasp was that their authority extended only as far as the aisle of that plane. Beyond those walls, his influence stretched far wider, touching industries, shaping policies, and commanding respect in spaces they could never enter. Their mistake was assuming that because they could humiliate him in that moment, they could define him entirely. They underestimated the reach of his voice, the depth of his connections, and the precision with which he could respond. Every slight they delivered was a thread woven into the fabric of their eventual reckoning. In their arrogance, they dismissed him as powerless, when in truth, the balance of power had already shifted. They had chosen to underestimate a man who lived in a world where silence was strategy and patience was strength. And while they believed the humiliation would end with the flight, he knew it was only the beginning of a much larger lesson they would never forget. The silent observation began the moment he realized the true extent of the prejudice being aimed at him. While others might have erupted in anger, demanding fairness or challenging the humiliation, he chose a different path. He sat back, his eyes steady, his face calm, and his mind sharper than ever. Every detail mattered, every word spoken, every gesture made, every look exchanged between the crew and the passengers. Silence gave him the advantage of clarity. He did not need to fight for attention in that cabin. Instead, he allowed the arrogance of others to reveal itself in full view. They believed their actions were small enough to be dismissed, but he noticed everything, and with each passing moment, he stored it away, cataloging the ways they sought to strip him of dignity. He watched the way the flight attendant's smile vanished when she turned to him, replaced by a forced tone that carried no warmth. He noticed how the tray of drinks lingered longer at the rows before his, how the gestures of service were deliberate and respectful for some passengers, but careless and dismissive for him. He observed the hesitancy in her voice when she asked him questions, the reluctance in her body language when she approached his seat, the subtle contempt in her eyes as she waited for his responses. To the untrained eye, these were minor slips of professionalism, but to him, they were markers of disrespect, signals of a deeper prejudice that no amount of surface politeness could hide. His silence was not emptiness, it was calculation. By remaining quiet, he allowed the cabin to continue its performance, and in doing so, he gathered all the evidence he needed. He knew that when people felt unchallenged, they became careless, revealing more than they intended. Every time the crew overlooked him or addressed the white passengers with exaggerated enthusiasm, he added another piece to the puzzle. His observation was methodical, as though he were studying a case file, preparing for a courtroom argument or a corporate negotiation where every detail could tip the balance of power. He understood that emotions cloud judgment, but silence sharpened it, and so he embraced the stillness, letting the crew bury themselves deeper in their own ignorance. The passengers around him provided another layer of insight. He noticed how some shifted uncomfortably, aware of the imbalance but unwilling to speak. Their silence was complicit, their eyes betraying acknowledgement even as their mouths remained closed. Others, however, seemed to enjoy the spectacle, smirking slightly as though pleased that someone they did not see as belonging was being put in his place. He read their body language as easily as he read financial reports, the crossed arms of disapproval, the tilted heads of judgment, the stolen glances meant to measure his reaction. He remained composed, offering them nothing, no sign of frustration, no visible anger, just a calm presence that unsettled them more than an outburst ever could. Silent observation gave him control in an environment designed to strip him of it. The attendants thought they had the upper hand, but his stillness created a discomfort they could not name. When someone does not react as expected, the script falls apart. They wanted him to protest so they could dismiss him as aggressive, or sulk so they could treat him as defeated, but instead he chose neither. His quiet watchfulness forced them to continue their charade without validation, leaving them exposed in their prejudice. It was a tactic he had mastered over years of navigating spaces where he was underestimated. Observation was not just passive awareness. It was an active strategy, a weapon disguised as restraint. He remembered boardrooms where silence won him more than speeches, negotiations where watching and listening revealed weaknesses his competitors never knew they had. This was no different. The cabin became another arena, the attendants and passengers his unwilling performers, their actions unfolding in a sequence he could analyze and later use to his advantage. Each slight was a data point, each insult a confirmation of bias, each careless mistake a record of the culture that allowed such behavior to thrive. His silence was not weakness, but an archive, a living record of everything they hoped would disappear into thin air once the flight landed. The beauty of silent observation was that it gave him power without others realizing it. They thought he was enduring humiliation quietly, but in truth, he was studying the mechanisms of their arrogance. He noted the hierarchy among the staff, the way junior attendants mirrored the behavior of their seniors, how prejudice was not just individual but systemic, replicated in gestures and routines without question. He saw the ripple effect of one act of disrespect spreading across the team, shaping the behavior of the entire cabin. To them, it was unconscious, but to him, it was evidence of a culture that needed to be confronted. His stillness also carried a presence that unsettled those who dared look into his eyes. When the flight attendant handed him a blanket without a word, he met her gaze steadily, saying nothing but letting her see that he was not broken, not diminished. It was a quiet defiance, a reminder that their attempts at humiliation did not erase his worth. The silence created a tension, a mirror in which their own actions reflected back at them, sharper and clearer than they intended. Observation was not just about him watching them. It was about making them feel watched, their behavior documented not with cameras, but with a mind trained to remember everything. As the hours passed, he sat in that seat like a judge in a courtroom, letting the evidence pile higher and higher. He observed the hierarchy of attention, the order of priorities, the unspoken rules that dictated who received care and who received contempt. He saw the passengers who thrived in their comfort, unaware of the injustice unfolding beside them, and those who avoided the scene altogether, pretending not to notice. He gave no outward reaction, no hint of the storm building beneath the surface, only silence that grew heavier with each insult, each smirk, each dismissive gesture. The strategic payback did not come with loud declarations or dramatic confrontations in the middle of the flight. It was carefully woven, a plan formed through patience and precision, built upon the silent observations that had filled the long hours in that cabin. He knew that true power was not in shouting back or demanding respect in the moment, but in crafting a response so calculated, so undeniable, that those who dared to humiliate him would be left with no defense. His strategy began with restraint, with the understanding that every insult he endured was not just an injury, but also an opportunity, a chance to gather evidence, and set the stage for a lesson that would strike deeper than any angry reaction could. The first layer of his payback was invisibility. By keeping his composure, he allowed the staff to continue their behavior unchecked, never suspecting that their treatment of him was being mentally recorded in sharp detail. They believed their actions would dissolve into the routine of service, forgotten as soon as the plane touched down. What they failed to see was that every dismissive word, every skeptical glance, every careless gesture was becoming part of a case he was building in silence. He did not need to confront them there because he understood that humiliation delivered in public was fleeting, but consequences delivered through influence were permanent. He considered carefully the resources at his disposal. As a CEO, his reach extended far beyond a single airline. He had contacts in the media, relationships with decision-makers, and access to platforms where stories did not vanish but grew into headlines. His payback would not be about revenge for himself alone. It would be about exposing the arrogance of a system that had grown too comfortable in its prejudice. The very crew who dismissed him as insignificant would find their behavior magnified under scrutiny they never imagined possible. By underestimating him, they had given him all the material he needed to dismantle their false sense of superiority. The strategy was rooted in patience. He did not rush to act, but instead let the events unfold, knowing that the deeper the humiliation went, the stronger his position became. Each moment of disrespect was fuel, each careless slight another stone to add to the foundation of his response. He thought of it as a chess game, and in that cabin, the staff had unknowingly made their opening moves with arrogance. They believed they controlled the board, but he knew that every move they made was leading them into a trap. His payback would be executed not in haste, but with the precision of someone who had mastered the art of timing. Strategic payback also meant choosing the battlefield wisely. He would not waste his strength arguing with attendants in the aisles of a plane. Instead, he would take the matter to arenas where his power could not be denied. Whether through legal action, corporate influence, or media exposure, he had the ability to shift the narrative from one man's humiliation to a larger reckoning for an entire company. His silence during the flight became a weapon afterward, because it gave him the clarity to act without emotion clouding his judgment. When the time came, his response would not sound like anger, but like truth, documented and undeniable. He envisioned the ripple effects of his plan. The airline that believed it could belittle him with no consequences would face questions it could not avoid. Executives would scramble to respond. Public relations teams would draft statements, and policies would be reviewed in boardrooms where his name carried weight. The attendants who had smiled so brightly at others while dismissing him would find their actions dissected, their arrogance exposed in ways they never considered. Payback, to him, was not about embarrassing them in the same way they embarrassed him. It was about restructuring the power dynamics so thoroughly that they would never dare treat anyone else the same way again. His strategy was also personal in its restraint. He understood that anger could be dismissed, that an outburst could be used against him, painted as overreaction. By remaining composed, he denied them the satisfaction of fitting him into the stereotype they expected. Instead, he embodied discipline, showing that his strength was not in loud defiance, but in quiet preparation. That preparation meant aligning his resources, gathering witnesses, remembering details, and waiting for the precise moment to reveal the truth. Strategic payback was not a single act, but a process, one that began the moment he chose silence over confrontation. He thought about the broader picture, about how many others had been treated the same way but lacked the means to fight back. His payback, in his mind, was not just for himself but for them as well. It was a way to use his position to bring light to the shadows where such prejudice thrived unchecked. By exposing the injustice, he would make it harder for the airline to repeat its behavior without consequence. His strategy was not born from ego but from a sense of duty, the understanding that power used was wasted, and he had no intention of wasting his. As the plane neared its destination, he remained still, but his mind was alive with plans. Every insult had already been transformed into a tool, every act of arrogance into leverage. The attendants still believed they had diminished him, but in reality, they had built the very foundation of their downfall. He knew exactly what he would do, how he would do it, and the effect it would have. Strategic payback was not about the noise of the moment, but about the silence that followed, silence filled with preparation, silence that would later erupt into consequences they could never escape. The tables turned not with a loud announcement, but with a shift so quiet and precise that those who had once carried themselves with arrogance barely realized what had happened until it was too late. The same attendants who had looked at him with suspicion, who had spoken to him with clipped tones, and who had offered him the bare minimum of courtesy were suddenly caught in a storm they had unknowingly created. The balance of power, once tilted against him in the narrow aisles of that first-class cabin, began to swing the other way, pulled by forces they could not control. Their assumptions, their dismissive gestures, and their smug confidence had all been based on the belief that he was just another passenger, someone without the influence to fight back. They never imagined that the man they had underestimated carried with him the ability to shift the narrative entirely, to transform their private arrogance into a very public reckoning. When the aircraft touched down and passengers began to disembark, the attendants went about their routine as if nothing had happened. They smiled broadly for those they favored, offered polite farewells to the white passengers, and barely acknowledged him as he walked past. To them, the incident was over, left behind in the enclosed space of the plane. They thought their actions had disappeared into the hum of engines and the bustle of travel. But the tables were already turning, and soon their behavior would no longer be confined to the memory of one man. His silence during the flight had not been surrender, it had been preparation, and now it was time to act. The first turn came through his connections. Within days, The story of his treatment was no longer a private humiliation, but a headline carried across platforms where his name carried influence. Journalists who respected him were eager to hear his account, and once they did, the details of the crew's arrogance spread quickly. The public, always drawn to stories of injustice, took hold of it, and soon the airline found itself caught in a storm of outrage. What had been whispered insults and subtle humiliations at 30,000 feet now lived on news sites, social media feeds, and broadcasts watched by millions. The attendants who had treated him as if he were invisible became unwilling symbols of systemic disrespect, their behavior dissected in articles, their choices questioned by strangers who demanded accountability. The second turn came within the walls of corporate power. He knew how boardrooms functioned, how executives panicked when public image clashed with profit, and he understood that reputational damage could cost far more than any lawsuit. Calls were made, meetings were held, and suddenly the very airline that had dismissed him as unworthy scrambled to address the backlash. Policies were reviewed, official statements were drafted, and apologies began to surface. But apologies were not enough. By then, the tables had already turned so thoroughly that it was not about courtesy or words. It was about consequences. The same company that had once given its staff free rein to decide who deserved respect now found itself begging for forgiveness from the man they had tried to humiliate. The attendants, once confident in their authority, now faced the consequences of their actions. Their names, once unknown outside their workplace, became associated with arrogance and prejudice. The pride they had carried in their uniforms turned into a burden, and their routines were interrupted by investigations, disciplinary hearings, and the weight of scrutiny. They had believed themselves untouchable, gatekeepers of luxury, but now they found themselves answering for every choice they had made during that flight. The calm silence that unnerved them on the plane had transformed into a storm they could not contain, a storm that followed them far beyond the aisles they once controlled. For him, the turning of the tables was not about revenge for its own sake, but about justice. He had endured the humiliation quietly, but when the time came, he ensured that their arrogance was not forgotten. The very qualities they mocked, his presence, his composure, his restraint, became the foundation of his strength. By refusing to react in the moment, he had denied them the chance to frame him as unreasonable or aggressive. Instead, his response was measured, precise, and undeniable, leaving them with no shield to hide behind. The same attendants who had once questioned his right to sit in first class now found their own positions questioned, their futures uncertain, their authority stripped away. Even the passengers who had watched silently as he was humiliated felt the shift. Some were now forced to confront their own silence, realizing that their unwillingness to intervene had made them complicit. They read the headlines, saw the public outcry, and remembered the quiet man who had sat among them with dignity. The tables had not just turned against the crew, but against the entire culture of silent approval that allowed such treatment to go unchallenged. The discomfort they had once projected onto him now returned to them, magnified by the knowledge that they had witnessed injustice and chosen to look away. The final turn came in the acknowledgement of his power. Where once he had been doubted, questioned, and diminished, now he was recognized, not just as a successful CEO, but as a symbol of resilience and authority. His story became more than personal. It became a reminder that arrogance built on prejudice could be dismantled by discipline, patience, and strategy. The attendants who had believed they could define his worth discovered that their judgment meant nothing in the face of the influence he wielded. The airline that had dismissed him learned that its reputation could crumble overnight when it underestimated the wrong passenger. And the world that had tried to silence his dignity was forced to acknowledge the truth he had always known, that respect cannot be dictated by prejudice, and power cannot be erased by arrogance. Respect restored was not a gift handed to him by the airline, nor was it the result of shallow apologies crafted by corporate public relations teams. It was something reclaimed, earned not in that first-class cabin where he had been humiliated, but in the aftermath when his silence, his strategy, and his patience transformed into undeniable power. The respect he regained was far greater than what had been stripped from him during the flight. It was respect reinforced by truth, amplified by influence, and acknowledged by a world that had watched arrogance unravel in the face of dignity. When the story reached the public, it became impossible to dismiss. People read the details of his treatment, the questioning of his ticket, the dismissive tones, the sharp contrast in how the attendants treated him compared to others, and they recognized the injustice immediately. For many, it struck a chord because they had seen or experienced something similar, moments where dignity was challenged not by accident, but by prejudice. His story gave voice to theirs, and in that resonance, respect for him deepened. He was not just a CEO who fought back quietly. He was a man who represented countless others who had endured the same humiliation without the same platform to respond. Respect was restored not only through recognition, but through the very manner in which he carried himself. He had not shouted or cursed during the flight, nor had he lashed out in anger. Instead, he chose composure, a calmness that unsettled those who tried to diminish him. Later, when the truth came to light, people admired not only his power, but his restraint. The discipline he displayed under pressure became proof of his strength. It is easy to demand respect when you have influence, but it is far more powerful to command it through patience and principle, and that is exactly what he had done. His calm silence on that plane became a lesson in itself, showing the world that respect can be reclaimed not through rage, but through wisdom. The airline, faced with mounting backlash, attempted to issue statements of regret, carefully worded apologies that tried to repair the damage. But those words, while expected, were hollow. True respect did not come from the company's effort to protect its image, but from the undeniable shift in power that had already taken place. The attendants who had dismissed him were no longer in control of the narrative. He was. The company that had allowed such behavior to exist was now answering to him, not the other way around. Respect was restored in the recognition that he had taken their arrogance and turned it into accountability, something far stronger than any shallow courtesy they could offer in the moment. In boardrooms, the story of his ordeal became a cautionary tale. Executives who once thought of him only in terms of business now spoke of his resilience and resolve. His name, already respected in corporate circles, now carried an additional weight. He was not only a leader in his industry, but also a figure who had exposed injustice without lowering himself to the level of those who tried to demean him. Colleagues, competitors, and even strangers began to see him differently, not as someone defined by the humiliation he endured, but as someone who transformed it into triumph. Respect returned not as something personal, but as something larger, a recognition of character and strength that extended beyond his own life. The attendants who had treated him poorly, once so certain of their authority, were forced to see him in a new light. They had judged him by appearance, by assumptions, by prejudice, and now they had to confront the truth of who he really was. The man they had questioned and dismissed turned out to be someone who could influence the very structure of the company they worked for. The respect they had withheld from him was now impossible to deny, not because he demanded it, but because he had shown them what true power looked like. Their arrogance had collapsed into shame, their false superiority replaced by the uncomfortable acknowledgement that they had disrespected someone whose presence commanded far more than they ever imagined. Respect was also restored in the eyes of the passengers who had watched silently as the humiliation unfolded. Many of them had assumed he would leave the plane quietly, carrying the insult with him and letting it fade into memory. Instead, they saw him transform that moment into a movement, one that forced an entire company to respond. Their perception of him shifted from quiet passenger to powerful leader, and in that transformation, respect followed naturally. Even those who had done nothing during the flight were forced to recognize his strength afterward, realizing that the man they had underestimated had shown them what dignity under fire truly looked like. The most profound restoration of respect, however, came from within. Though he had endured humiliation, he never allowed it to define him. He knew who he was, what he had built, and the influence he carried long before stepping onto that plane. But experiencing the blatant disrespect firsthand had been a test, a trial that could have shaken anyone's sense of worth. Instead, he emerged from it stronger, reaffirmed in his identity, his principles, and his resolve. Respect restored meant not only regaining what others had tried to strip from him, but strengthening it, transforming it into something unshakable. In the end, respect was not restored because the airline offered apologies, or because the world demanded justice, but because he had shown through action, restraint, and strategy that dignity cannot be erased. His story became proof that humiliation does not have the final word when faced with resilience. The crew, the passengers, the airline, and even the broader public were forced to look at him differently, to see not the man they tried to diminish but the leader he truly was.